Thank you for joining us here. So I'm going to jump right in and start with a question, I think both for Ernst and Birgit, and perhaps uh, as a way of getting to the question, a while ago during a radio interview, I was asked, or actually not even asked, the presenter, who is no politician herself, just casually mentioned this statistic of, whites still own 72% of the land. And immediately I was thinking about AfriForum's previous report and all of this, but it's so difficult to condense all of it into 1 minute. So, Ernst, from your side, and Birgit, if you are in a radio interview or whatever conversation and you have only 1 minute and you have to refute this statement of whites own 72% of the land, how would you do that? And also, uh, would you just say another figure, say it's not 72%, it's 21% or whatever, or would you approach it in another way? Ernst, if you go first.
Well, Louis, I mean, yeah, that's the nature of when you're answering a question on radio or television is you get 1 or 2 minutes to answer often questions that relate to very, very complex issues, as has been demonstrated today by our presentations and our speakers. But my answer is always very simple, and my answer is another question to the person posing this type of statistic, and that's asking them, where does this statistic come from? Where did you find this claim? And then secondly, do you know how, if you know where it comes from, do you know how this source calculated this statistic? So they'll often answer, yes, I heard the president say it, or I read it in the Land Order 2017. Often it's a bit much to ask, it seems, for some journalists to read the document where the statistics that they cite comes from, but let's say they do cite the 2017 land audit. When you then answer the follow-up question of, well, do you know how they came to that percentage? The person has no answer. They just took it at face value. And I think that demonstrates the flawed nature of the statistic, is that people, because they heard it or they read it and it came from what they saw or interpreted as a authoritative source, they just take it at face value rather than interrogating it or engaging with it critically. And as soon as you ask them some critical questions, their entire narrative falls apart. They are forced to come to the conclusion that, no, I just read it and it sounded right to me, or it sounded correct to me, and therefore I accepted it as truth. And that usually shuts down the conversation in regards to, this is really just a narrative that you fell for. You didn't actually engage with the fact critically and thought critically about it. Where does it come from? How was this statistic reached? How was it calculated? You just read it. It sounded nice to you. Maybe it confirmed a narrative this person already had in their mind, and that was good enough for them.
Okay, thank you. Birgit, your comment on this?
Yeah, I think Ernst has answered that question. The bottom line is, what's the basis for such a figure? And simply we don't have any data to support that kind of figure. And then the key thing is, how was it calculated? What are the sources? The reliability of those sources, the sources been verified. It's just simply going through the process of unpacking such a figure. You know, it's easy to quote any figure, but if you've got to backtrack and start unpacking it. And unfortunately, in terms of the land report, we had never had the opportunity to interrogate or interact with the people who compiled that report. So it was delivered and it was there in the public domain. And then people start reading without understanding what lies behind certain things and start making inferences. And as Aaron said, if a figure suits the argument, you take that figure and you run with it.
Yes, thank you. So still staying on this topic, because it's so central to this conference and the entire public discourse surrounding EWC, if you can reject the figure of 72% and disprove it and say, well, even citing a figure isn't really helpful because it's too complicated to express in a single percentage. If you're simply discussing this, then at some sense you are still accepting the premise of demographic representativity. And I think that's a premise that we need to reject as well, saying that there's no universal principle, there's no God-given law that says, well, if there are 4% of whites in the country, then whites should own 4% of the land, and for every other race or people. And Ernst, I would like to ask you as well, how would you dismantle this premise of demographic representativity?
Well, it's as I said in my presentation, the whole idea of demographic representativity. If you want to create laws that execute this idea, you're basing it on a "you'll know it when you see it" formula. Where if you ask the person, well, if again you ask a critical question when a person or someone tells you they support a policy of demographic representativity, or a policy that reinforces this racialist agenda of every facet of society needs to have this amount of racial bean counting that needs to be applied there, you can just ask them once again, based on what criteria are you, or do you want to embark on this project? And they'll say, oh, we will use the criteria of these different categories: white, colored, Indian, and so forth. And then you simply you ask them, what is the definition? Can you give me a definition of any single one of those categories that form the central part of your whole project? Your project of, I want to distribute X or Y or Z according to these categories. How do you determine those categories? And they will not be able to answer you. They will tell you, oh, but you know it when you see it. You know a black person when you see a black person. You know a white person when you see a white person. But then when you tell them, actually, no, there's no definition for what you're talking about, they will start panicking and they will start fidgeting, because in the end, the only real test that they can fall back on is the apartheid government test of the pencil test or anything similar, where some contrived, strange test is concocted to try and determine someone's race, because there's no legal definition that determines it. So once again, just as with all these statistics that are uncritically parroted, many of these ideas and schemes of politicians, they've not sat and thought for 5 minutes about what is the actual basis of how I'm going to execute this plan. They just say, I want to distribute resources based on race, or I want to redistribute land based on race. But as soon as you ask them, how are those racial categories defined that form the central part of your whole plan, they will not have an answer for you, or they will give you an absurd answer like, we will test it with a pencil. And that's really the basis of it, is that any race-based project, whether it's the apartheid government's project or the ANC government's project, any race-based project is going to have to fall back on these race-based categories that are just baseless. They don't have any definition. They're not rooted in reality. They're rooted in the mind of the politician.
Anything that you would like to add?
Yeah, I think if we want to look at it, apart from the political argument and demographics and so on, why try to compel anybody to own land? You know, if it's a choice, why should you own land? You know, many people don't own land and quite happy for whatever reason. And then also, what's land there for? Is it the economic production input? Is it a security of tenure? It's not an economic thing if you stay in a house in the city. Is it for whatever reason do you need land and so on? I think that's a valid question. So the motive behind such a question or strategy should be questioned. Why a race? Why own land? Why do you need land? And what do you want to do with it? I think it's valid, and it's more contextual than the political argument. This is simply a political argument that we're talking about.
Sorry, can
Yes,
I also
yes, please.
add on here? The issue goes beyond the national figures. It's also about the regional ones. So if the ownership of land should reflect the composition of the population, they also want to measure that per region. The implication is that on Ingwenyama land, there should also be this percentage of brown people, of white people, of Indian people. And then that debate takes another turn. One of the key issues for us as farmers is that there is a big distinction between land and farms. Not all land is farms. A farm is a piece of land, but it's much, much more. It is also a business plan, massive investment. It's management, and there's no switch off button for that. This is the issue with which the Zimbabweans are grappling right now. They took land. They want to compensate for the improvements on the land because there's no moral justification for having taken that. But now it's no longer there, and that is what makes the land a farm. And unfortunately, in our engagement with the House of Traditional Leaders, with many CPAs across the country, even amongst a majority of the beneficiaries of land reform, they think about land instead of farms. And this is why the farming operations grind to a halt. If Minister Nkwinti said 2018 that 90% of the projects have failed on the business side, I still want to see the remaining 10%. There are successful farms too, but very, very few and very far apart. And the main reason for it is not because they cannot farm. The majority of them can farm. They cannot do it profitably. The businesses does not make sense on it. They stop, they break the linkage to the markets. They produce only for themselves. They turn commercial agriculture into smallholder agriculture and staansboerderye. And unfortunately, this means knocking down our biggest asset in the rural spaces, the businesses, the job creators, and those who can earn dollars where we need it most in the poorest regions of our country.
Yes, back to what you mentioned, Ernst, I remember, I believe I was still in high school when then President Jacob Zuma shuffled the cabinet late at night some evening, and I saw on the news that there's a new Minister van Rooyen, who's Minister of Finance, appointed Minister of Finance, and I was somewhat surprised that I thought, oh, he must have appointed an Afrikaner or a white person, and I was quite surprised. And lo and behold, the next morning when I saw the newspaper, Mr. van Rooyen is not an Afrikaner, and that just made me think about whatever your taste for being white or black, whatever race, or the data that takes surnames as proxy for race quite often failed. But in any case, Ernst, just one question regarding AfriForum's current efforts to prevent expropriation without compensation and the Expropriation Act. So you mentioned AfriForum's court case that started in March and with a date in August, if I'm not mistaken. What happens after that? What are your expectations?
Right. So I think 2026 is going to be defined as one of the years where private property rights is one of the biggest fights of the year, just because of the long-reaching implications of if we win or lose in this fight. Luckily, that court case has started now. It started in March this year, and it's going to continue in August. It's not AfriForum alone in that case. Many other parties have joined it. And it is to ensure that expropriation without compensation and this plot to expropriate without compensation is stopped, and that the Expropriation Act is stopped in the sense that it is no longer a threat to private property rights in this country. But AfriForum's strategy is two-pronged. On the one side, we have the court case. We fight in court to protect private property rights, but we also have an international component where we try to the best of our ability, provide good quality information to people internationally to add pressure on the South African government to rather protect private property rights than threaten it. And we've been very successful so far in that regard. And I also want to give the opportunity to Theo de Jager or Dr. de Jager to give us SAI's side of how they are also fighting back against expropriation without compensation and to protect private property rights, because I know that's also a major focus area of SAI.
One has to use every lever which you can get your hands on. Remember the whole expropriation thing, the whole issue of less than market related compensation is a political one. It is to feed the narrative of stolen land. And we have seen it with the way it surfaced every time before an election. This issue was rife in the run-up to the 2004 election. Again, 2009, in that election. Then in the 2014 election, it was another angle of it. It was reopening restitution claims, which they succeeded in, but then the Constitutional Court closed that avenue until this first batch of claims, the 1998 claims, were finalized. We are currently locked in a legal action against the Department of Land Reform on that, because we asked in a PAIA for the list of land claims as it had been received in 1998, and they cannot give it to us. We've been to court 4 times now, and they cannot give it to us. They don't have it. And we are pushing them, saying, if you report to Parliament every year that we are now 94.2% done with land claims, there must be a list against which you measure it. But apparently, it is not. And this is why you can slip in land claims all the time. That complete list was never in the public domain. And it also means that the judgment in court that we first have to finalize the 1998 claims before the second round can be reopened. We will never get there. But then again, 2017, it was the ANC's resolution, which Arends alluded to, which was a big thing in the run-up to the 2019 elections. It seems that it is always the joker in the pack to be played when you are caught with a poor hand. But it was the same in Kenya during the Mau Mau. It was the same in Mozambique. It was the same in Zimbabwe. This land issue is this joker in the pack to cover for a poor hand. If you cannot show or you've not performed on promises. Now, one of the big levers is, of course, foreign governments. We often talk to embassies, not only European embassies or the USA government, but especially with African embassies. There's a program where the Kenyans, the Tanzanians, in Ghana, ourselves, South Africa, engage on a regular basis with the Germans, with their Andreas Hermes Academy and the BVVG, the Agency for Land Reform. And before the Ukrainian war, at every digital meeting, we had the Russians there too, because somehow there's this fixation, the romanticization of nationalization of land with how it was done in the old Soviet Union. But to look at international best practice. But also, there is the engagement with beneficiaries of land reform, and there are more and more of them who are really serious about farming. And the threat against property rights for us is as big for them. How do you invest in a farm of which you do not have the title deed, of which you can easily be shifted off? At the moment, we have 4 members of SAI, 3 in Mpumalanga, 1 in the Eastern Cape, who are approaching the end of their lease agreements in the redistribution program, the PLUS, the Proactive Land Acquisition Strategy. And they have all been notified that government is not going to extend their lease because this farm is earmarked for a better connected person, the deputy mayor of the local town, the member of parliament who is about to retire. So they start to understand how important it is that you have security of tenure, and there's no better security than to have a title deed in your hand. But of course, the courts is also an avenue. And apart from that, there's the media, which have somehow backfired a little, especially with News 24, You might remember how hysterically they reacted when we quoted our experience of Ackerland, but also Driefontein and also the mortuary in Heidelberg, which were at the same time more or less expropriated without compensation. And our argument has never been that we see massive expropriation without compensation across South Africa. We say we have seen a few instances, and we are alarmed by it because we know what it takes to fight it. And why do you want to pass an act like this if you do not mean to implement it?
Thank you. Burger, one more question for you. You mentioned that we do not have good data anymore, and I believe you also said that the data on land ownership is getting of worse quality than it was before. And is there any way for private individuals or organizations or landowners to ensure that in future there will be good data available about land ownership?
Yeah, I think we've got, in terms, at least in terms of our deeds data, our cadastral system, I think one of the best developed systems that I know of, and it's recognized internationally. But again, it's like everything is the maintenance of that system. And transactions still do take place. I've quoted the figures of 300,000 residential transactions per annum. The farms are changing hands, etc. But it's keeping the records and properly keeping records. But as we see that, as some of the difficulties in deeds offices that we know about of registration of land, surveyed land, etc. We find private companies, private sector stepping in and actually building databases of that. Still, it's a legal requirement. If you want to have title to a piece of land, you've got to go through the land registration and your title deed processes and so on. But I think the record keeping side, we see it more and more that private sector companies are stepping in. And well, for everything, we spoke about what's happening on the ground and so on. And even in terms of technology, we dealing with companies that can tell you on a daily basis what has changed in South Africa in terms of land invasions and so on, in terms of whether you has plowed his fields and so on. You can see those kind of things. But it's stepping in. It's a whole science of change detection, and it's available. But we've got the tradition in South Africa that we don't put value on data. We always had a good system. We received it for free. We didn't pay. And even in government, doesn't matter how good data is available, the whole notion that you actually got to pay for that information and so on. And it's powerful. It's out there. But I think it's as most of the things as there are challenges in governing and maintaining systems, the private sector is stepping in. And I think there's companies, and there's more than one, doing an excellent work in maintaining at least the access and the records on these things. They cannot do it. The Act governs that. But in terms of administrating and having access to that, it is there.
Okay, thank you. There's lots more which I'm afraid we're not going to get at, but I want to open the floor for 2 or 3 questions from the audience, just by raise of hands. And if you ask a question, just introduce yourself. There you.
Hi, thank you all. This is Offensive from the Center for Risk Analysis. I wanted to ask what work is being done by the respective organizations on protecting property rights, but work done legislatively. Are there any bills you're sending to Parliament, any communication you have with some members of Parliament? Thank you.
So from AfriForum's side, seeing as we are an organization that operates outside of the party politics sphere, Our focus is primarily on the court fight or court cases, and then also on the international pressure side and information dissemination side. I don't know from the size side in regards to bills or pieces of legislation, but AfriForum's focus by nature of our organization is outside of the legislative part and rather on the court fight side and providing good information side.
From our side, we have engaged with 4 political parties, 2 of the bigger ones and 2 of the smaller ones, to come up with possible alternatives. Or remember, it is not the whole Expropriation Act that is evil in our eyes. It's the part on compensation. And we've engaged on policies. What can we change to make this act better? And what it is basically go for market-related compensation, go for compensation being established by a court of law at the end of a legal process and not before it started. And we managed to sell this to quite a number of embassies. We have engaged with many embassies in Pretoria, but also in Europe and also in the USA, to the extent that in the USA last year, they made this one of the 4 conditions to normalize the diplomatic relations with South Africa again. It was the kill the farmer, kill the boer thing. It was prioritizing rural safety. It was about exempting US investments from BEE and employment equity, and then to change this act and specifically on these 2 issues, market-related compensation and established by a court of law at the end of the process. But then we regularly write about it. It's important for us to equip our members, farmers out there, when they engage on a local level or on a district or provincial level, that they have the right arguments. And we also do the distribution of material on this. If when I saw this publication, and congratulations with it, the first thing when we broke for tea, I asked Arends if I can send it out to our members too, because at the end you need to mobilize as wide and as deep as possible.
And yes, just to add to that note of Dr. De Jager, this document is not only available here in physical form, there's many, we printed a lot that you can take multiple with you, just on request, just ask if you want more than one, and then also it will be available online on our website. And also, if you can't find it for some reason, you can always send me an email if you want the PDF, but it should be easy enough to find.
Okay, any other questions? Arno, also.
To Burgert, sorry, Arno Rood from the Solidarity Movement Trust. In light of the increasing growth and development that we see within communal areas and the older traditional areas that you mentioned, what is the risk both to the land debate that we currently have, but also specifically to kind of the financial and economic reality with that development in the absence of things such as title deeds and formal land ownership structures with that whole system based on more traditional ownership systems?
Yeah, I think just to state again, it's a trend that we observed. As I said, we're not sure why it's happening, but I think the implications is quite important, especially at local government level. We know that in terms of local authorities in South Africa battling with financial liquidity, the ability to bill people for this, and there's 2 elements. From a property tax point of view, property taxes are not levied on traditional land, communal land, so that deprives the municipality of that tax revenue. And I think in terms of the kind of development that takes place, and there's a data set nationally that actually represent the or calculated or shows the replacement structure of cost of every structure in South Africa. And it's been costed, and it's billions and billions of rand that's locked up in that sense. If you look at the type of development we see, it creates a huge loss for municipalities as we don't levy property taxes. In terms of the property tax Rights Act, there's no reason why it shouldn't. But the problem is that land is either in state ownership or under other provincial custodianship, state custodianship. So basically, for that thousands and thousands of or millions of hectares of land or thousands of hectares in the municipality can value it and they can send the provincial government a property bill every month, but that doesn't happen in reality. Secondly, those areas traditionally were very well served in terms of water, electricity, services, and again, electricity in those areas primarily it's Eskom-based distribution. So there's strong systems of prepaid metering, but again, the municipality's been excluded from that. And water, again, it's well reticulated, so people got access to water, but the billing for that. So it constitutes a development, and it's not in all respects, a poor type of or indigent type of development that deprives a local authority from revenue for the services rendered and the access to services. One can look through the list of municipalities, local municipalities in financial trouble. And the moment you move into an area there's communal land, it's guaranteed that you're in financial difficulties. We see that across the spectrum. So the implications of that, I think, when we start again looking at agriculture expropriation as such, it comes to the economic use of that land, why it's used. But the interesting thing to me from an urban planning perspective is why are people settling there? And if you look at the kind of structures that are being built on that land, I think it's something we need to explore. There's no answers, but the implications, I think, at local government level, it's much more than it is for the land debate as such. It affects the sustainability of our local government system. And saying in that, you'll know that the white paper on local governments under review, the first draft's been published, and the traditional leadership system is not recognized in local government. It creates tremendous tensions in local authorities, where you've got tribal heads, tribal authorities, that runs in parallel to your local municipality. Those tribal authorities are still represented by elected councillors that's not necessarily affiliated with the local people there, and it creates tensions in terms of land use rights of development on that land. There's a lot of political tension even in the review of the white paper, the role of traditional leadership in local government is not recognized. There is a token representativeness or arrangement, but they're not part of the decision-making process in that. I think there's a consequence in that. There's the financial consequence, but on the expropriation debate and so on, I don't think it's got a direct bearing on that. Ownership might be an argument, title deeds, etc., where we promote that, but we see that not regarding the fact that people don't have title deeds, they prepared to do huge investments on that land as well.
I think we have opportunity for one more question and then we will close off. Nobody? Okay, thank you for joining us today. We've then reached the end of our program. We appreciate your attendance and all the support. You're welcome to kuier a bit more outside. And once again, all this video content will be on our YouTube channel, and you're welcome to share it with friends or family. And our website, onteiening.co.za, is the main hub where There are previous research reports and submissions and all the information, and which you can also navigate to from the AfriForum homepage. But we most of all appreciate AfriForum membership as the main way of supporting us. Thank you and have a good day.